The phenomenon I'm going to talk about today, well, most of you will be familiar with it, I think, maybe all of you. Well, I hope that all of you is familiar with it. What is it? So here are a few examples to get you close to it. Perhaps you witness your young daughter first public piano or violin performance at school. Perhaps you witness a mother finding her child after having lost the child for 20 minutes. Perhaps you witness this brother and sister who haven't seen each other for 50 years and there's suddenly a reunion. Or perhaps finally you hear about you or a friend of yours getting this job that you hoped for so long, etc. And suddenly you feel your chest expanding and you want to cry, and maybe you have a lump in the throat and you feel your face going like this, and you can feel the tears going down your cheeks. You are moved. Or we use the phrase, I am moved, is moved, to often to refer to this kind of phenomenon, affective phenomenon. So that's what I want to talk about today. And I want to defend the claim that being moved is a distinct emotion. In fact, a distinct positive emotion, as opposed to another affective phenomenon. How am I going to do that? Suzanne said yesterday that philosophers used to do conceptual analysis and find necessary and sufficient conditions for whether something belonged to a certain category. But they moved on. Well, I haven't moved on. And I think the basic method is going to be that. My excuse is that the topic is very continental, so there's going to be a balance. There is an empirical version of this talk. In fact, in the paper, which I wrote with Florian Kova, all I say is backed up, or more or less backed up by data and stuff. So, but today I'm the philosopher, I have my philosophy hat, so it's going to be mainly speculations. My commentator will certainly have things to say about the empirical dimension of what I'm talking about. That's it. Let's start. So I'm going to first try to get you to understand the main idea. Then I'm going to draw the profile of this emotion that is being moved. And in the third part, I'm going to distinguish being moved from, try to distinguish being moved from other affective phenomena such as sadness and joy. And if I have the time, probably I won't, I'll talk about the threat of the vice of sentimentalism. So what do we refer to with the expression I was moved, or this was moving? The first possibility is that when we do that, we refer to unspecific feelings. There's just some steering inside me, maybe. Feeling of some bodily changes, but it's all very vague, inchoate. That's one possibility, and that's why we just say, I've been moved. There were movements inside me that I can feel. Or maybe that's not really the case. Maybe what we do is that we refer to a specific collection of feelings, but we fail to specify what it is. Maybe it's an ordinary emotion, but for some reason we don't know what it is on the spot, or we know, but we don't want to mention it, so we just say, I was moved. If these were the correct answer, then it's no surprise that nobody ever been interested in being moved, and there is so little in the literature about that. For there is nothing specific about it, or if it's specific, then it's covered by studying the other emotions. Both hypotheses, I think, are wrong. I'm not going to show it here today, but notice the following. You would never report these kind of episodes, being frightened, being angry, being amused, being ashamed, by saying that you were moved. It's not that I heard this joke, very funny, I was very amused. That's not the case. You would report using, I was very moved by the joke, or ashamed, etc. So this certainly doesn't show, but raises the possibility that being moved refers to a distinct emotion. Or better, that being moved is a distinct emotion. So I'm interested in defending the metaphysical claim that being moved is a distinct emotion. And I think that being moved refers most of the time, the way people use it, to a distinct emotion. But that's secondary. What I want to do here is really sort of draw your attention to one specific phenomenon that most of the time we refer to with the expression being moved. So, how do we know that some affective state constitutes a distinct emotion? Well, as you know, we often complain that there is very little consensus in the literature about what an emotion is. But still, I think fulfilling these criteria here, these 5 criteria, is sort of a quite conventional or consensual way of trying to get at what emotions are. For an affective phenomenon to be an emotion, it has to have an object, to be directed at an object. You are afraid of the dog. This contrasts emotions with moods, perhaps, that do not have to be about specific objects. They have a formal object, philosophers say. They use this expression of formal object, although there's no object there, which is just to say that the emotion evaluates the object, the situation, the event, in a certain specific way. In fear, for example, the object is evaluated as dangerous. Danger is the formal object of fear, and I'll come back to that in a second. Oh, sorry. Then it is often claimed that emotions have specific phenomenologies. So being afraid feels not only different from being amused, but it feels different from being angry and ashamed, etc. Emotions have action tendencies, or typical action tendencies. We tend to flee when in fear. And perhaps they have a function as well. Fear, the function of fear, is precisely to avoid dangers. So, does our candidate emotion of being moved satisfy these conditions? That's the second part. So, I think it's correct to say that we are always moved by situations, events, objects, etc. Being moved typically are directed at some specific objects in the world. And here are some examples. A kind gesture, perhaps an unexpected gesture. The reconciliation of 2 estranged old friends. A long hoped-for victory. Hopeful sign of the end of the hostilities. The freedom fighter liberated from prison. Impossible love. The last words of a dying mother to her children. The sacrifice of the soldier, etc. So the claim, of course, is not that we are all the time moved by these situations. Yeah? There are central cases, maybe kitsch cases, but typically, those are instances that may move us. Note that you might be witnessing the situation. You're a spectator. You look at the situation, but you might also be an actor in them. You might be witnessing someone having kind gesture towards someone else, but you might also be the person who is the recipientary of this kind gesture. Also, note that these things might happen in real life, but we often feel moved in the theater, the movie theater, or reading, etc. Maybe more. We let ourselves be moved more easily in these situations than in real life. But most definitely are possible. Now, second criterion. Emotions are not only directed towards objects, they apprehend this object in a specific evaluative light. So the evaluative property corresponding to an emotion type is called by philosophers formal objects. So the idea is that, like, although fear can be about any specific object, particular object, the dog, the exam, my father, etc., it always evaluates this object in the same way, in the light of a specific value in the case of emotion. The formal object sort of individuated type of mental state we are dealing with. A little bit like you can believe many different propositions. 2 plus 2 equals 4. My mother is in Geneva. American cheese is delicious. But in all these instances, okay, you hold these propositions true. Okay, the formal object of belief is true. So in the case of emotions, values are the formal object of emotions. So the appeal to formal objects is quite helpful theoretically. So I've just talked about individuation. It helps you understand what the emotion is about when you understand that shame is about degradation and anger is about offense and fear about danger and amusement about the comical, maybe. It also helps you rationalize the emotion when you understand that that the subjects construe the situation in the light of the relevant value. So you understand why this person is afraid when you understand that this person takes this nice little dog to be dangerous. And then you can also, on this basis, assess the emotion. Like, well, it's a very little dog and very nice, so your emotion might not be appropriate in this case because there is no danger there. So this is why it is helpful to speak of values in connection to emotion and individuate them like that. So our question now is whether being moved has a formal object of that kind. Is there anything common to all the situations given examples like 3 slides earlier and all those cases that move us? Yes, of course. So here was my first attempt at uncovering the formal object of being moved. What we are moved by is the presence of the positive in the negative. More specifically, we are moved by positive values emerging, generally winning over or resisting negative values. So that's the case, for example, like the strange friends that reconciliate, so friendship winning over petty quarreling, courage winning over death and war, etc. In all these examples, it felt like there were positive in the negative, and sort of the positive was making a stand Not that perhaps it's the beginning of a good characterization, but it's not going to be enough. Yeah. For example, if you are a wedding, it's extremely boring, but you have a nice glass of very delicious Bordeaux in it. So there's positive in the negative, but that won't be enough to move you. So there's going to be some work to do in order to make this work. So perhaps it has to be important values. Maybe a good Bordeaux is not enough really to do it. It has to be core values. So here was my hypothesis a few months, years ago, well, 2 years ago. We are moved by core positive values made salient by a background of negative values. But that's not good enough too, because, for example, you're not going to be moved by an homicidal psychopath maniac killing a whole family, but then spares the little one because, you suddenly feel empathetic to the little one. You're not going to. And maybe that's a core value, like that. So, anyway, that's not too bad because, anyway, this claim is wrong. Sort of wrong. My set of example was in fact non-representative. So that was my first hypothesis that I just said, and then we went on and we tried to test whether I was right. So we asked people, like students of psychology in Geneva, and then we did this with être ému and then with being moved. And we realized that in fact, most cases they report are not cases in which there is positive value that emerge or wins over negative value. So what they report is weddings, baptisms, surprise parties in their honor, academic or sports achievements, and even just beautiful landscapes. And the main example is always birth of your child. So these are purely positive cases. So I have no problem reinterpreting them by saying that there is, in fact, negative in the background, but I've been told that that's not allowed. So I changed the theory instead. But not much. So the idea is that we are moved by core positive values, either because they are made salient over or by negative values, the example I just presented, but also in cases in which this core value is mise en scène, is made particularly salient by a special and ritualized celebration, like in baptisms or weddings or surprise party in your honor. That's ways of showcasing a certain positive value. And sometimes you don't need any mise en scène. Just the setup is so incredible and extraordinary, like in birth. Or sometimes you walk up the mountains and suddenly the majesty of the mountains strike you as beautiful, and this is enough to move you. So that is the claim. So now, of course, we want to know, okay, you said our core values, okay, so what's that? So I'm not sure I have a very decisive and penetrating characterization. But first, it seems correct to say that we do not have all the same core values. Yeah? So we need something else than just a list of core values. So also not basic needs. Okay, so food or sex won't be core. So one possibility is that, okay, something is a core value if it exemplifies, is a core value if it's not treated as a commodity. So that's not me, that's Deadlock and associates and colleagues. The idea is that, well, there are some things of values that you are ready to trade, okay, but There's things that you won't do. For example, you won't break a relationship with your with loved one in exchange of 20 boxes of a good Bordeaux, for example. You're not trading love relationships. You cannot just exchange them as you would other things of value, other goods. I think it's enough to give you an idea of what I mean by core value. Yeah? And typically, they're going to be things like friendship, love, courage, health, life, duty, etc. So, in conclusion of this section on formal object, we are moved by particular situations, events, facts, etc. Let's call this the target of the emotion that exemplify a specific core value. Let's call this the focus of the situation. I'm not sure whether I borrow this terminology to Bennett or to D'Souza or a mixture of both. It doesn't matter. The goodness of which we experience as standing out, as making a stand. So, in all cases of being moved, the value, the positive value, is very different. It might be courage, it might be family relationship, it might be beauty, etc. But what strikes you in all these cases is the goodness of the value in the case. At least that's my tentative claim for the formal object of the emotion. I move criterion. Does being moved have the distinct phenomenology? Yes. So you can have a local approach to phenomenology. You say, well, sorry, like before I started, it's always very different to give convincing descriptions of the phenomenology of emotions. In this case, it might be a bit easier than usual because it has an important bodily dimension. Yeah. So increased heart rate, warmth and expansion of the chest, lump in the throat, and tears. And indeed, people report when they are asked what they feel, they report these kind of things in connection with being moved. We can also approach the phenomenological question in different terms, in more sort of gestaltic or holistic term, yeah, which I'm more interested in. So perhaps it's correct to say that in being moved, you have a revelation, sort of epiphany, or a re-revelation about something you care about. And we say, well, I was overwhelmed, knocked over. There's an element of surprise of this happening now in this case, yeah. But it doesn't always have to be the case. There is a feeling of depth. Sorry about that. But maybe the feeling of depth sort of echoes or corresponds to the core nature of the value. It's something important. And there is a sort of, the thing happens to you and you have a sort of, you feel deferent towards it. You submit to the fact that this is good. And people report that there is something like a relief or contentment about that. And on the whole, although the phenomenology is close to, at least at the local level, close to sadness, overall, people report, and I think that's correct from my own introspection, it is pleasant to feel moved. If you are not embarrassed by it because you are in public circumstances or something like that. We like to be moved. Does being moved have specific action tendencies and a specific function? Well, initially, it doesn't look like it. When you are moved, you're just by something. You're just paralyzed. You just look like this, and it doesn't look like you're going to do anything that is very profitable to anybody or to yourself. You're just there, crying. Yeah, at least in the intense, strong cases. But perhaps it is a mistake to think of action tendencies always as being relevant on the spot, on the moment. Yeah? In fact, when you think about other emotions, this becomes obvious. So, for example, think of shame, a negative emotion. So it's true that it has action tendencies on the spot immediately when you feel shame. You want to disappear to the ground, you want to hide from the eyes, the gaze of the others. That's the first moment of shame. But shame has also more long-term action tendencies. Perhaps once you recovered from the initial episode, you're going to think, well, I don't want to find myself in this situation again. Okay. You might want to reform. I'm going to change myself so as not to be this person who's going to be in this situation in which I'm going to feel shame. So I'm suggesting we have to think of long-term action tendencies in the case of being moved. And anyway, it's not clear. I've said being moved is a positive emotion. Well, it's not clear that positive emotions have any distinct action tendencies. Yeah? In fact, psychologists claim that with negative emotion, very often, okay, it restricts behavior. It engages you in a quite specific behavior, like in fear, fleeing, or freezing, etc. But with positive emotions, it's just quite the reverse. It opens the horizon. Yeah, it makes you think of different possibilities. So joy, for example, no obvious action tendencies, but perhaps it broadens your horizon. Now you're sort of ready to think in ways you weren't ready to use beforehand. You deliberate differently, etc. Okay, this is not my idea. Fredrickson and other psychologists, but I think it's correct. So my hypothesis is that the function of being moved is the following. It generally leads to reorganization, prioritization, and reaffirmation of your values, because you focus on the importance of that value. And if everything goes all right, you will result in their promotion within your life. Note that the action tendencies will be sometimes agentive, meaning involving behavior, but mainly it's going to be cognitive. Yeah, you're gonna the fact of having almost lost your companion, your partner, will make you think that I should invest more time with this partner and less maybe home. You reorganize your priorities, etc. So fundamentally, and then maybe might lead to real behavior, etc. And it's not obvious that it's easy to investigate empirically, because in all cases of being moved, it's going to be different depending the action tendencies or your thinking, because the core value is going to be different in different cases. Okay, what about a more evolutionary function? So I'm not a real friend or understander of that, but some people, I think, will be happy or reassured if there was also an evolutionary function. So I don't know about whether I believe what I'm going to say in this slide, but for now. Being moved is a tool to solve cooperation problem if it contributes to attract other cooperators by signaling oneself as a good cooperator. And I find it quite convincing, actually, that seeing someone being moved signal this person as someone attached to certain values. And often these values are the values of the community. But like, this guy is a real human being like me, he's part of our group, our community, etc. And tears are hard to fake. So this is not something, it's not just pretending. And it contributes to maintaining cooperation and refraining from free riding. Reinforces core values such as friendship, solidarity, and bonding, all of which foster continued cooperation. So let's sum up. Being moved seemed to be a genuine emotion type, as it has intellectual objects. I said it's a core positive value. As a formal object, its goodness standing out of this value. A distinct phenomenology, and has the function of prioritizing, or I'm not going to pronounce it, certain core values, and fostering action promoting the values in question. So that's the end of my positive defense of being moved, but not the end. I mean, it's done one bit. Now let's look at possible objections, or ways of thinking about it that might raise questions or worries about what I've said. Aren't we moved by purely negative situations? So I've claimed that being moved is positive, and you are always struck by the goodness of a situation being moved. But that doesn't seem right. Someone tells you, I've been moved by reading Primo Levi, This is a Man. You're not like, no, you're not being moved by it. Yeah, not possible. Only positive stuff. That doesn't seem right. Yeah. And in fact, in our empirical studies about that, many people report cases of compassion and sadness. I think they were moved in these situations. In fact, something around 15 to 20% of situations reported by our participants are cases of that kind. So one possible reaction is to be very sad that this is the case. The other one is trying to find the ways out, and that's what I'm going to do. Here's a possible response, and I think it might be quite convincing. In fact, compassion, sensitivity to the suffering of others, okay, is not moving. Or losing something which makes you sad, that's not in itself moving. You are not moved because the guy suffers. You are not moved by the fact that you lost this very dear person. But typically, compassion and sadness are occasions for being moved. If you feel, when you feel compassion for someone, you are also very often moved by the dignity of the person, the will to live, the humanity of the person. And and all these things are definitely moving, and as you notice, they are all core values, as the theory wants. So that's my response. And with sadness, it's a bit the same thing. Okay? Sadness, you are sad because you lose something you care about. And if the sadness is not too violent, recedes a little bit, then this is also an occasion for being moved, because it's the occasion to focus on this good thing that you have lost. And this is what moves you. I'm playing. I hope you all agree. So that's one possible answer. And another possible answer, which is compatible, is to say that people use being moved in these cases too. I was moved by this dog, run over by this bus, because in fact the phonology of sadness is very close to the phonology of what I've been trying to describe under the name being moved. And also, this is an easy move, but it's not just idle speculation in my part. In fact, if you take the answers for phonology and you separate cases of positive cases of being moved and negative cases of being moved, the profile is quite different. So in both cases, they report tears very strongly, and acceleration of heart rate, I think. But expansion of the chest and warmth in the chest, which is an important marker of being moved, is not present in the negative cases, suggesting that we face different phenomena. So this is my claim about why there aren't negative cases. Situations being moved is a positive emotion in the sense that I've tried to isolate. Now, what about, okay, so it's not sadness, it's not compassion, but maybe it's joy that you've been describing all along. If that's the case, then it's not that interesting what you've been telling us. So one possibility is that, indeed, the objection goes, being moved is just a very intense joy. Well, not. Just imagine someone winning the lottery. Yeah? So wins a small amount. Yes. And you win a but yes. Now you try like 2 million. Yeah. Okay. That's not what I've been describing under the name being moved. Yeah. So this is not the case. Another possibility is that being moved is joy, okay, when its object is a core positive value. So winning a lot of money maybe doesn't count because it's just money. Although we can, for someone for whom it is a core value, okay, winning in terms of amount will be an occasion for crying. Anyway, you understand. So I don't think it's right, yeah. So for example, we don't want to describe a case such as the sacrifice of the soldier, yeah, which might be very moving, by saying that this is a case of joy, of intense joy. So that's not good either. Still, there is an overlap between some episodes of being moved and some episodes of joy. And these are the cases when you are crying for joy, yeah? So some cases of being moved are indeed just another way of describing this emotion that we know under the term crying for joy. Yeah? So for example, perhaps seeing your daughter perform at school for the first time, and you are moved, that's the case, and you cry, it's a case of joy. But definitely not a complete overlap between the two phenomena. Okay, I have another 5 minutes, so I'm going to say just very, very briefly something about sentimentalism. So being moved is this emotion that nice to feel, pleasant. We like feeling moved, because when we feel moved, we feel we care about something. The less you feel moved, the less you feel that you care about stuff. But sometimes we are moved in inappropriate ways, and we are just being sentimental. So there is often something wrong with how or why we are moved. Especially, for example, if some people go and see like 7 times the same Hollywood movie, just to cry. So when this happens, the person subject concern is likely to be called a sentimental. And it'd be nice if our account has the power to shed light on the phenomenon of sentimentalism. Yeah? Can sentimentalism be explained in terms of problematic instances of being moved? And I think it can. So the ways of sentimentalism. Some cases are epistemically problematic instances. So the problem might be that you're just excessively moved by something. So it's true that it is moving, indeed. That's a moving situation. But just, you overreact. Yeah. That's not too vicious. I mean, we quite like people, or I do, that are excessively moved. Certainly better than people that are never moved. Yeah? This is not someone you want to be friend with. But anyway, so one possibility is just you are excessively moved. And then you may be just unfittingly moved. Just you are moved by the situation, but the situation is just not moving. You remember that the nice thing about formal objects that it tells you, it allows you to assess the emotion in terms of its appropriate or inappropriate character. So of course I'm not going to tell you what are inappropriate cases, but just imagine this person who is moved by a rose, because this rose is the symbol of purity winning over capitalism. It's just like a person is crying. That's inappropriate. Very inappropriate case of being moved. Yeah? And this is more serious kind of problematic instance. But when being moved becomes really problematic, vicious, I mean immoral, maybe I'm overplaying. It's in these cases when we enjoy being moved for the experience itself and not for what the experience reveals us and thus recommends in terms of the core positive value that you're experiencing. So that's why sometimes we go to the movies just to enjoy the experience itself and not the exemplification of the core positive values and what this requires of you in the real world, acting, okay, promoting the value in question. And perhaps it's right to say that in these cases, you are viciously sentimental. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julien, and thank you, Jeff Seidman, for inviting me. And it's too bad that Jennifer Beer couldn't be here, but I'm delighted to be here and respond to what I think is a wonderful example of how to go about defining something as an emotion and bringing it into the corpus of phenomena that we consider emotion. It's a perfect thing. What Julien has done here is a perfect thing for me because for the past 35 years or so, I've studied tears and the occasions on which we cry. And so I found much to like in Julien's account of being moved. And so I'm going to mostly say positive things about this wonderful paper and try and add a little bit to what Julien has done. So let me say at the outset that I agree with Julien's conclusions about whether or not being moved counts as a single distinct emotion. But being moved in some sense is a funny emotion because it does seem to have many of the qualities of genuine emotions, but it's been hiding in plain sight in lots of ways. And so what I want to do is look at the ways in which it shares characteristics with other emotions, particularly its phenomenology, and as Julien has pointed out, its action tendencies and behaviors. It shares those with other emotions, but there's something distinct about it. I'll say more about this in a moment, but I do want to say this. The Latin root of the word emotion means literally to move out. And in the 1650s or so, it was first used in the English language, the word emotion, to refer to feelings. And that really became popularized in the early 1800s. So there's a way in which this being moved might be the kind of emotion, the sort of first emotion that we think of. Julien argues that being moved is a specific affective phenomenon because it satisfies 5 distinct interrelated criteria for what counts as an emotion, as you've just seen. And that the most important one is the formal object of the emotion, that it focuses us on our core values and has something to do with goodness. Well, how you define emotion partly depends on what you want to do with your definition, your presuppositions, and so forth. Philosophers and psychologists often have differences in how they define emotions. It's certainly different kinds of psychologists differ greatly in how they define emotion. I think that Julien is mostly correct in his analysis, but I want to comment on a few aspects of what he has to say about defining emotion. And what I see is as not so much as a missed, but a kind of somewhat unappreciated aspect of the experience of being moved, as well as one of the behaviors that seems to regularly accompany being moved, namely crying. And what I want to do is just point out the ways in which these, I think, are very central to both the experience of being moved and how we evaluate it as a distinct emotion. Okay. So first, borrowing from the work of the psychologist James Averill, and full disclosure, I was his graduate student. He was my mentor. One of the criteria that I use in defining emotion is whether or not the collection of thoughts and feelings, physiological changes, behaviors, and so on associated with the emotion are experienced as beyond the person's control. That is, experienced as a passion rather than an action. Now, Julien speaks in his paper on being moved as being moved involves a sense of being taken by force. as having an intrusive nature, right? And if we think about the various examples he gave, and if we think about our own examples from our own lives in which we've been moved, um, it seems to me that being moved does have this feature, and I think it's a central feature. And as Julien says, being moved by something is either unexpectedly and in the form of an eye-opening experience, having one's attention drawn toward its object in a way that calls for one to dwell on it. So in a way, whatever is going on with being moved, we are forced to confront certain values that we have. Okay? And I think that's what's so powerful about being moved. But notice the lack of agency in the way Julien has characterized this. Right? Interestingly, being moved involves those aspects of ourself that centrally define who we are. Right? So there's something kind of funny going on here for me as a psychologist. Being moved points us to our core values, and yet it feels like something that's happening to us rather than something that we do. Okay? And there's a paradox here that I can't yet solve. And that's because our passions usually hide the involvement of our will. Not something psychologists like to talk about, but too bad for them. We experience our anger, for example, as beyond our control precisely because we would love to throttle the object of our anger, and the threat of our doing so because we're out of control ensures that that person, right, will not provoke us again. In other words, we gain something from experiencing our emotions as passions. And so the paradox here is, or the thing to think about is, what do we experience being moved as a passion? Right? What do we experience by that? Or what do we gain by that experience? And that experience pointing us to central aspects of our core values. Let me say something about action tendencies. In a worldwide study that Odd Fingerhoots from Tilburg University in the Netherlands and several others conducted in 1999 and a couple years after that, when people all around the world were asked about the occasions in which they're most likely to cry and in which they have cried, things like weddings, hearing one's national anthem, having a sports team one supports win an important match, greeting a friend they haven't seen in a long time, were all at the top of the list. Okay? What do these situations have in common? Julien would say that they involve being moved and having one's attention drawn to the important values that sustain the person and his or her connections with his or her community. I've argued that crying on such situations, especially when many people are crying and we can see that they're crying, serves as a marker and an inducer of group cohesiveness. When one sees others crying for ostensibly the same reason as we are, it cements our place among those others. So I think Julien essentially has argued the same thing, namely, quoting him, that experience of being moved can actually constitute a signal revealing the values to which an individual is attached, manifesting his potential as a cooperator, that was one of the slides, and to the extent the external manifestations of being moved involve hard-to-fake cues such as tears, it's a much more reliable signal than others. So I would argue that part of what's going on in being moved, and maybe part of what helps to resolve the paradox, is that being moved gives rise to the tears that signal group belonging and a shared experience. And as Julien says, an experience of oneness. Right? That can be a very powerful experience. And that feeling of oneness, right, if it's experienced in a crowd, is tremendously powerful in making us feel we are like other people. We share something with them. We share something deep inside of us. So I don't disagree with Julien on what he says about being moved, tears, and the signal value of each of those. But I think the relationships here point both to the action tendencies associated with being moved and the possible evolutionary functions of the emotion. Now, when psychologists talk about evolutionary functions of emotion, a lot of times it's just so stories. You know, here's what I think, and okay, back it up. How is this an adaptation? Well, you know, I'm kind of at that stage with this, but I think there is something beyond the specifics of tears that point to what the action tendencies associated with being moved are and what the evolutionary background of being moved in tears are. Now, the two sides of the coin of this emotion, I think, indeed, are the reorganization of one's hierarchy of values and priorities and one's feelings of inclusion in one's social group. And the social group can be both imagined and real, I think. Each of these creates and supports the other. And the medium of the message, I think, is tears. And of course, I would have to say that after studying tears as long as I have. Now, let me end by pointing out one potential challenge I'd see to Julien's account of being moved. And it's a challenge that all of us psychologists who study emotions from a particular perspective face. There's going to have to be considerable and considerably clever empirical work done to reveal the appraisals involved in being moved, right? That is, to do the experimental work where we bring people into the laboratory and working from what they've said about their own experiences, their everyday experiences of being moved, and trying to really home in on, okay, what is it about the relationship of these participants to their core values that results in these feelings and potentially these action potentials, right? We all, I think, have a sense of what these might be, what the appraisals might be. And it's relatively easy to do things like write up a paragraph description of positive and negative, you know, foregrounding positive and negative values while manipulating this or that aspect of it, like lots of social psychologists do when they look at appraisal work. But with almost all research, experimental research on appraisals, are the paragraphs the participants read and respond to really reflective of what gives rise to the emotion in the real world? That is, appraisals, and I would say I'm an appraisal theorist. I wrote an appreciation of Magda Arnold, who I think really advanced our understanding of appraisals more than lots and lots of people in the early 1960s. But appraisals are hard to catch, you know, just like tears are hard to catch in the laboratory. Participants' accounts of what they might do in particular situations are always secondhand, a creation of their conscious knowledge of how they would react to the emotional stimuli that are presented to them, and their awareness that they're participating in a study. That's always hard to erase. Is it ethical to create deep and meaningful feelings of being moved in a group of undergraduates, let's say, in the laboratory? Can we actually do something like that? Maybe. Some of us have succeeded in making people cry in the laboratory for various reasons. There's among the community of people who study crying, we all have a set of films that we pass around and scenes from films that are, you know, so-called tearjerkers. And I have had people, while they're on film, watching another film in my laboratory, openly sob. And when I asked the participant, because I was concerned for, actually 2 people did it, The person told me a story that was not unlike the story Julian was telling. That something in the film, this was actually a film about someone who was a college-age student, and he went to visit his institutionalized grandmother, who may or may not have Alzheimer's. You don't know, right? And for the students who really sobbed about it, they said, well, I have a grandmother like that, right? And I feel just like I think he felt, right? So there was a real sense of being moved in those situations. So sometimes you can do that, right? But it's really hard. And it's really hard getting at whether what that person just said is really what moved them. That is what the appraisals were. The appraisals are, I think, the right way to think about emotions, but they're really tough. Okay. And just to put a final touch on that, any values that any participant mentions in such situations are implicit values. Okay? They're only made explicit when we ask them, and that may make a difference there. Okay. So I think what I'd like to say is I don't really have any ideas for how to uncover these appraisals, especially in a way that is kind to the participants in my research, and I like to be kind to them. Perhaps the greater understanding that I now have, thanks to Julien, of what it means to be being moved and its relationship, that experience's relationship to tears, might help me figure this out. So I would like to thank Julien for a marvelous analysis of an emotion that's been sitting under our nose for a very long time, but is now out in the open. So, thank you.